Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Alvaro Huerta, and today we have a brilliant speaker, Professor Gonzales, and she's going to give us a book talk, or deliver a book talk on her recent book on Chicago. And I just want to say that I'm very excited about this. She's a Ford Fellow, like myself. She's a wise Latina, like Sotomayor once said about Latinas, and she's here to educate us about her findings in her recent book that she just recently published, but also open up in terms of her own example and trajectory to the university, like after the book talk is over, to motivate and influence other young people, especially people of color, Latinas, in terms of pursuing graduate school or even becoming a professor, and even writing books. You know, why not, right? You know, she's gonna make like $1 million off this book, so hopefully everybody buys it. I have to pay them to publish my book, so I think we're in a different situation. Okay, Professor Gonzales, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Huerta. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to meet you all. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my beautiful PowerPoint that I put together. Can you all see? Can you all see this? Awesome.
Yeah.
So again, just thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Big shout out to Dr. Huerta for the invitation. I am really excited to be here with you all. I also wanted to thank Justin Torres and Chris Saletta for their coordination, for all their hard work, and also making sure this is seamless. I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to your questions, later on after the talk. So as Dr. Huerta mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you all about my recently published book with NYU titled Building a Better Chicago, Race and Community Resistance to Urban Development. This was published last June of 2021. There we go. For some reason, the clicks aren't working. So I'm going to give you just a brief overview of the book, and then go into, kind of more of a central discussion on the importance of what I'm calling, organizational mistrust or collective skepticism, and really thinking about using mistrust as a tool in community organizing. And then as part of that, I'm going to discuss the ways that grassroots organizations, who are primarily led by women of color, really work to ensure that resident ownership of development plans in low-income communities of color are really realized and are rooted within community involvement. So throughout the book, I more broadly analyze like a lot of different redevelopment players in Chicago, especially as it relates to development. So this includes, everybody from city agencies to nonprofits to grassroots organizations, and then also national community redevelopment intermediaries. So for the book, I focus primarily on the Local Initiative Support Corporation. I don't talk about them a whole lot in the presentation, so I'm happy to dig a little bit deeper into who they are, but they're this national foundation that's really rooted in trying to think about community development across cities throughout the US, and both in good ways, but also in problematic ways. So I also look at trust primarily as a process of socialization, right? And then also the complementary strategies that different kinds of nonprofits engage in, but then also the ways that mistrust, right, that collective skepticism can be harnessed by community groups as a strategic tool within redevelopment initiatives. So this is just the cover of the book here. I really like it. So just to give you an outline of what the different chapters look like, in the introduction, I'm really drawing on my own experiences in Chicago to provide that background on redevelopment initiatives within African American and Mexican American communities. And I'm outlining the different approaches to redevelopment and the importance of community organizations in ensuring resident inclusion within redevelopment decisions. Then in chapter 1, I'm problematizing ideas of trust and mistrust within low-income communities. And then I introduce that concept of collective skepticism as a rational and strategic form of mistrust. And then I talk about other, forms of networking within these types of relationships that are a lot more collaborative. Then in chapter 2, drawing on insights learned from community organizers, I look at how nonprofits are located within a system of power that oftentimes privileges the wealthy and the politically connected. So then we also learn in this chapter how urban elites attempt to control redevelopment through targeted strategies that promote building these relationships of trust between a lot of different kinds of community-based and citywide agencies. So part of what I look at throughout the whole book is how trust is often used in this really kind of normative way to seem like it's always a good thing. And I ask us to really take a step back, use our sociological imagination and say, is that really the case? What is happening here? What are the impacts and the outcomes of engaging in trusting relationships? And then where do relationships of power come into play? So then chapter 3, I look at the often diverging tactics, strategies, and programming practices of different kinds of community-based organizations, primarily that are rooted within leadership development of low-income residents. In chapter 4, I trace coalition building among grassroots community organizations, and I expand upon different kinds of networking opportunities that really emerge within these spaces and how grassroots groups use that idea of collective skepticism to influence large-scale development decisions. In my concluding chapter, I really consider the value of trust and then start suggesting new ways of engaging residents to improve resident-led inclusion at all levels of redevelopment. So this includes research, planning, implementation, but then also assessment of the results of those redevelopment plans. I also in this chapter explain how collective skepticism can be used by marginalized populations to network and also yield more equitable results. So the last thing that I just want to highlight, it's not really part of the formal book. This is one of my appendices, but I think it's important to highlight and particularly right for undergraduate and graduate students, I like highlighting this one in particular because I'm thinking through the methodological approach to ethnography. I'm an ethnographer, and the importance of understanding, but then also considering right imbalances of power between ourselves as students, as researchers, as connected to a university, and then the community members that we're working with, right? So what does it mean to have the power of the university behind us, even if as students or graduate students, it always doesn't always seem like we have some level of power, we do, right? So what does that mean when we're engaging in this kind of research? And how do we kind of think through ways that we also have to problematize trust in those spaces? And I'm happy to talk about, more of any of these things throughout the Q&A. So while the book takes a much broader approach to understanding how community organizations and City Hall engage in development decisions and then the tensions that arise, for today, I'm going to focus primarily on the tactics employed by residents, activists, and local nonprofits. Before I do that, though, I just want to give a little bit of context. So within the city of Chicago, city officials, the MacArthur Foundation, this is the foundation that does like the MacArthur Genius Grants. They're a really large philanthropic organization in the city, but then also nationally. So we had city officials, that the MacArthur Foundation, and then a national community development intermediary, what I had mentioned before, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, partner up with local community-based nonprofits to collaborate on a 10-year, what ended up being a $900 million initiative across 16 communities of color. And so if you look at these little red areas here, this is where all of those neighborhoods were located. It was called the New Communities Program, and it really tried to draw on resident feedback to create really large-scale land use plans within each neighborhood to kind of guide development decisions, decide where new housing was going to be created, business was going to be attracted to, if new parks were going to be built, things like that. As part of these conversations, the New Communities Program, this was the initiative, targeted certain neighborhood nonprofits to act as what they called lead agencies. These were their partner nonprofits. And then those agencies were asked to engage in relationship building, and they had access to some seed money, and they were invited to network with a lot of different city agencies and City Hall. During the initial phase of the New Communities Program, which launched in 2002, again, this was a 10-year project, this really centered on the creation of resident-informed quality of life plans within each area. And then to create the plans, the lead agency nonprofits would conduct town hall meetings with residents. And this was over 12 to 24 months. Some neighborhoods, it was closer to 24. Other neighborhoods, it was really 11 to 12 months. And then during those meetings, the nonprofit staff used community visioning techniques, which meant that they would divide attendees into these really small groups and ask them to indicate through drawing on maps or through creating phrases their ideas, their hopes, and their plans for their neighborhood's future. So like, what would they ideally like to see in their own community? Then that staff would collect those ideas and use them to inform these final quality of life plans. So these images here are just kind of what the front covers of those plans look like after they had collected all of this data. So that process of community engagement, asking about one's hopes and dreams for their neighborhood, really served three goals for the city, right? First, it captured residents' visions for the future of the neighborhood, while also outlining a path for achieving those goals. So it wasn't just about what are your hopes and visions, but then the staff would really kind of sit down and say, how is it that we're going to try and realize some of these things? It also served as an initial step in socializing these nonprofits, these lead agencies, into a particular model of community development that was connected to the city. Because they started, right, the lead agencies, these nonprofits really started using a lot of the language, the cultural ideas, right, the behaviors and the rhetoric of what community development looked like, but they would then implement it in their neighborhoods, and all of that information was coming from the city. Third, it really laid the groundwork for building hierarchical trust relationships amongst residents, those neighborhood nonprofits, and city halls, right? So it was consistently about always creating flows of trust that moved upwards towards City Hall. So community meetings really compelled residents to reimagine their neighborhoods, right, creatively and interactively. Because of that, many residents believe that they had substantial input into those development decisions. They were asked about their hopes and their dreams, so they felt like, well, if you're going to ask me, you're going to try and realize them, right? So today I'm going to focus primarily on grassroots organizations and how they, use what I'm terming as collective skepticism to really kind of ensure that some of those hopes and desires for the communities were realized. And I focus on two particular neighborhoods. Again, the initiative was in 16. I focus only on two. This is Greater Inglewood and Little Village, or La Villita. I'm going to briefly reference issues that happened within these two communities, but I'm more than happy, again, to talk about this a little bit more during Q&A. So within these two communities, there, as we can see just from here, right, there are some stark differences. So located on the near southwest side of Chicago is Little Village. It's home to one of the largest, both documented and undocumented Mexican immigrant communities in the Midwest. And then located 8 miles southeast of Little Village is a primarily African-American neighborhood of Greater Inglewood. I chose these two communities out of the 16 because they were considered the most distressed within that citywide initiative. At the same time, however, there are enough differences in terms of political history, nonprofit capacity, racial and ethnic background, and what have you, to really provide an understanding of the ways that City Hall and these other external power holders could influence community development within these high poverty communities. So for instance, at the time of the study, Greater Inglewood had a 50-year history of disinvestment, weak political representation, a significant loss of population. So at that time, they had lost almost 23% of their population.
Oh my God, my mother.
Between 2000 and 2010.
Okay, excuse me, Professor. Okay, we need people to mute, and I'll go see. Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you. And then there was also high levels of empty or abandoned lots. So there were approximately in this one neighborhood, 8,500 just empty abandoned buildings and lots. And then on the other hand, we had Little Village, which had a really strong small business district. So their small business district is called just 26th Street, and it rivals like the really high end, shopping district in the city that attracts a lot of the tourists. Within Little Village, right, their sales are oftentimes more than this really kind of fancy place in downtown Chicago. It had really strong political representation, even though it has really low voter turnout rates, and then strong ties between local nonprofits and municipal and state politicians. It also had some population decline between that time, between 2000 and 2010, which is about 13% of a decline, but it was still densely populated. So given the political and historical differences between the two communities, right, the neighborhood nonprofits, grassroots organizations really responded differently because they had these different histories, right? It made sense. But even though they were responding differently, they were still able to get some kind of unique needs met for the community. Before I go into what that looks like, just to give you a sense of the work that I did. So this was a 30-month ethnography. I started it in 2011, did full 2 years straight to 2013, and then came back in 2016 for another 3 to 6 months to collect some additional data to kind of flesh it out a little bit. This included attending a lot of public meetings, going to community advisory meetings, info sessions. I became a member of 6 community organizations, 3 in each neighborhood. I did content analysis, archival work, and then a year into doing participant observation, I then started in-depth interviews with 45 key informants. And this was with a variety of really key players within the city. So from my observations and those interviews, it really started to become clear that community groups, the city, and these redevelopment experts were really all talking about the importance of trust, right, and getting things done in Chicago. They all kept saying the only way we're going to get anything to happen here is to really build trust relationships between these various different groups. So when we start talking about trust, we have to really think about what does that mean, right, in the grand scheme of things. So on the one hand, we know that networks of trust can socialize organizations into a common culture where everybody's speaking the same language, right? We see this when we're thinking about our friends and we start hanging out with our friends a lot, right? We start to talk in the same ways that they do. It also means that, right, if we're socializing each other into this same model, we are all then going to have similar goals at the end of the day. Networks of trust also increase accountability and opportunities, and they ensure that members of community organizations are considered for grants and that are privy to sensitive information, right? Because if I'm in a network of trust with City Hall, that means if a new grant opportunity comes to the table, folks at City Hall are going to say, oh, let me reach out to this one nonprofit because I already have a relationship with them. I know that they're good people and they're going to be able to get the work done, right? On the other hand, if we think about what happens within these networks of trust, they can really shield organizations from scandal and criticism, right? So if an organization is really kind of doing some nefarious things or doing things that aren't really to the benefit of residents, if they already have a relationship with City Hall can shield them a little bit from that criticism. They can also set a development culture that reinforces class and race-based inequality and promote an area's development agenda to really only reflect the desires of urban elites. So research on networks of trust often suggests that these relationships often come at the cost of resident empowerment and community-led redevelopment. So as I was conducting fieldwork in Chicago, right, and talking to people, I really started to think through how is it that trust operates within these networks? And what does it mean for community groups really attempting to bring lasting positive change to their neighborhoods? Given that Black and Latino, Latinx populations make up the majority of the city. So the city of Chicago is a third Latino, Latinx, a third African-American, and then a slightly less than a third white and kind of white populations. So that means this is very much a POC city. So given that, what does this mean when we start talking about relationships of trust? At the same time, when we have to consider that Black and brown populations are also the most marginalized politically, socially, and economically. So what does that really mean in these contexts? So as I was doing data collection, I found that the more kind of grassroots activist-oriented organizations really were more willing to kind of engage in these relationships of trust and mistrust with a critical eye towards community outcomes. So in the next part of the talk, I want to start discussing, right, the importance of problematizing these ideas of trust and mistrust. But before I do, I want to root this a little bit by introducing you to Ernie, who is one of the kind of main folks, the main key players that I talked to while I was there. So Ernie, this is not an image of Ernie Jones. For anonymity issues, I don't use anybody's real names. I don't have pictures of any of the folks that I interviewed. But this is just to give you a sense of the kind of work that he would do. So Ernie Jones was a consistent presence, always at community meetings across the city of Chicago. And as a longtime community activist and executive director of a university-based community engagement center, he really focused on the arts within communities of color, and he was really committed to working towards racial unity between Black and brown populations of Chicago. He did a lot of stuff around racial healing between Black and brown populations. So during one of our many conversations, right, Ernie and I discussed the benefits and challenges to community engaged work. So we were sitting right during one of these conversations, he had this really cramped office in a very affluent, predominantly white neighborhood. And as I was talking to him about this, he started raising issues himself about trust, engagement, and resident skepticism around city-led redevelopment. So in particular, he reflected on a deep history of foundations, right? Think back to MacArthur Foundation, of foundations and city officials ignoring the capacity of neighborhood groups, right? There was this constant kind of dismissal of what was happening within these neighborhoods. For Ernie, right, he said government officials really aren't interested in engaging and empowering poor residents of color who might actually disrupt elites' visions of how a city should look or might even look. So when I asked him specifically about the New Communities program, Ernie sighed really deeply and he kind of shook his head and he said, quote, "It's a shadow, if you will, of what's to come. At the beck and call of the mayor, people don't trust them, and that's okay," end quote. So over the course of my research in Chicago, I really saw like this idea of people don't trust them, right? So I saw how rampant mistrust was blamed for a number of unintended negative consequences, right? Across development issues, issues of crime, issues of education, what have you. People kept blaming this idea of mistrust. I heard comments such as, quote, "Issues of trust, it's all about competition for funding, competition for community leadership. It's about perceptions of power and leadership." And then also, quote, "Everyone has their own agendas. They're shady. They're not committed to the neighborhood. It exacerbates mistrust." So these kinds of comments, right, were consistently in relation to understanding the challenges to collaboration for community groups. But as several people highlighted, including Ernie, right, issues of money, political clout, and ego all really played a significant role in perpetuating mistrust among and between community groups, right? A lot of these community nonprofits. But if we reflect back, right, to Ernie's comment, "That's okay," we can begin to understand that there's a place for this kind of mistrust in community development. So as I was thinking through this, I wondered then, how can mistrust work with community efforts for change, right? If nobody's trusting each other, how can we actually have a community building, movement building, and community change to happen? So before we can answer that question, I want us to understand what trust is and then how it operates. So at its core, trust is a social act, right? You can't trust if you don't have a bunch of people together, basically. At the interpersonal level, it really allows people to build relationships and take risks that might be mutually beneficial. The literature on trust really highlights an expectation of vulnerability and an understanding of certain rules of behavior. So a person who trusts, right, they're going to expect their trust not to be abused. But they also know that there's still kind of a risk, but they're expecting that, you know, everybody's coming to this relationship with a little bit of vulnerability at hand. A person who trusts, I already said that. So trust, right, if we think about it in this way, it's both a hope, but also a risk and a way of acting towards other people. It's also when we think about relationships and these networks of power, right, and how development happens within a city, it's also important for expanding those networks of trust, gaining access to new resources, and then also gaining access to new kinds of information. At that neighborhood level, communities with really high levels of trust usually have higher levels of employment, lower high school dropout rates, and then also greater appeal, right, to people who want to move in, but also residents who live there. Between organizations, it allows, right, to build that capacity, leverage those resources, and then also acquire new resources. So the idea is that within poor areas, within under-resourced areas, trust is really important for people to get things done. But, and this is what I found as I was doing this research in Chicago, if we start analyzing trust through a lens of unequal power relationships, right, particularly paying attention to the perspectives of local Black and Latino, Latinx residents, who oftentimes are very much informed by a long history of racialized and classed dispossession, marginalization, and uneven redevelopment, trust isn't always, right, this great, wonderful, beneficial thing. Instead, it can also replicate and solidify social injustices. This is particularly true within relationships between neighborhood groups, funders, and City Hall, where we see, right, these unequal power relationships. So while trust is always seen as kind of this great thing, mistrust is also viewed in a really negative manner, right? It's seen as creating barriers to community building, increasing negative outcomes to poor areas. It's also pathologized, like poverty is, as an individual weakness, right? It's indicative of flawed character, that these people don't trust anybody. So to explain its persistence in low-income communities of color that are oftentimes marked by decay and disinvestment by the state, mistrust is oftentimes racialized, right? So it's the idea that Black and Brown people don't trust because of their local culture, because of these issues of poverty. So by taking mistrust to this interpersonal level, not only does it pathologize it as an extension or as a condition, but also an extension of overwhelmingly racialized poverty. So it means that, right, poor people have to learn to fix their own behaviors with mistrust, and they need to learn to trust the state, not the other way around, that the state needs to kind of figure out what's going on and why there's mistrust and maybe adjust its own behaviors. So if we think about trust in this way, we can see that it's linked to issues of privilege and power. And in the case of Chicago and many other cities across the nation, this implicitly privileges whiteness and reinforces systems of control that really consistently marginalize communities of color. And so while development organizations and the city might say, oh, residents just need to trust us, as I mentioned before, trust and reverse, trust from, right, these power holders, from City Hall, from foundations, back to residents is often minimal, right? It's kind of oftentimes dismissed. So given this link to power, within the book, I argue that instead of viewing mistrust as kind of this passive outcome of oppression and individualized, racialized, and classed flaws, we might instead see it as a logical reaction to implicit and explicit structural racism. At the same time, rather than leading to kind of apathy or, oh, I give up, I don't trust anybody, instead, I argue, mistrust can be strategically harnessed within community organizing, and it can be used as a way to confront ongoing neighborhood exploitation. So what does this mean in the context of Chicago, right? So while I was there, I saw community organizers consistently work with each other, but work with each other in a way that wasn't like, oh, I completely trust the city, oh, I completely trust these other nonprofit organizations, but rather, right, it was that, oh, we need to get certain things done, so let's start engaging in very strategic relationship building so that we ensure that our own goals are met at the same time that we're gaining access to some of these resources that power holders have. So within Chicago, I was a member of 6 organizations, but I just want to briefly mention 2 kind of key ones. This is the Resident Association of Greater Englewood, a predominantly Black women-led organization within Englewood, and then the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, or Alvejo, which was primarily a Mexican-American, Chicana kind of led organization that was really rooted in issues of environmental racism within Little Village. So RAGE was founded in 2010, really as a response to consistent lack of interest within the neighborhood, and was really about trying to combat negative narratives of their communities. It included 60 members at the time, and was very purposely not a formal nonprofit. So they had no funding. It was just all an association of residents who came together to really get this work done. And then Alvejo was formed really out of this desire to address ongoing social issues in Little Village or La Villita, again, focused on issues of environmental racism. So while both organizations really engaged in a tremendous amount of actions within their communities, I'm just going to focus very briefly on 2 and discuss what those look like. So in Greater Englewood, earlier I mentioned there's 8,500, right, abandoned and vacant lots and buildings. So in Greater Englewood, right, RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood, really started engaging residents in a process of education, collaboration, and coalition building, because they felt like in order to really hold politicians accountable, they needed to have an active resident base. They used this idea of collective skepticism or strategic mistrust of all of these redevelopment initiatives to really start strategically partnering with citywide agencies. They attended a tremendous amount of training sessions on local zoning laws. They spoke with urban planners about how decision-making was happening in their community. They partnered with graduate students in urban design. And all of these efforts were mostly driven by a desire to increase resident leadership skill sets and ownership of the neighborhood. So using those kinds of tactics, RAGE worked to reclaim a lot of that abandoned and blighted spaces within their community. Out of those conversations emerged that large lot program. And so here we just kind of get a sense of what those 8,500 abandoned and vacant lots look like. So the idea was to really start getting some ownership within the resident base of these abandoned lots and to start redeveloping them and claiming ownership over this in kind of unique ways. So to get that off the ground, during the summer months of 2013, RAGE members surveyed community members and collected information from about 60 residents regarding interest in the program. Like, is anybody really interested in kind of owning some of these vacant lots? During those conversations, residents mentioned that they would really like to have larger yards. They'd like to have some open spaces for things like public art or community gardens and other kinds of community spaces. Residents also expressed some frustration with current land use initiatives that really didn't take resident constraints into consideration. So there was, within the city of Chicago, there are a lot of these kind of empty lot programs, but oftentimes those empty lot programs, you have to own the house, and then the empty lot next to you on either side, you can kind of purchase at a discounted rate. And so residents were saying, you know, we have 8,500 abandoned and vacant lots, right? So I may want to have a lot that's across the street from me, or it's down the street from me, right? It shouldn't have to be just something that's next door. So RAGE members brought all of this information to the city, really worked with folks within city planning to then say, how can we reimagine what this large lot program would look like? How can we ensure residents can gain access to some of these lots and ensure that it's affordable? So this is then where that, you know, buying some of these pieces of land for $1 came into existence. Further conversations after the implementation of the initiative revealed that residents couldn't really identify which parcels of land were available. Some of these empty and abandoned lots weren't owned by the city, they were owned by private entities. And so if they're owned privately, right, those aren't the ones that are for sale, but residents couldn't really easily see which ones are available, how can I access this, how am I even eligible, right, to purchase any of this. So in order to address that barrier, one of the RAGE members, Douglas Hampton, he has extensive training in computer coding. So he used his technical expertise to then develop this website here for the city of Chicago. So that way residents could very easily input an address and identify any city-owned vacant land that was on their same block, right? It made it very, very easy. So when I spoke to people at the Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, I talked to both Christine Jasper and another gentleman. Christine said, it totally blew my mind, right? It was perfect. It had all the open lots that existed in the area, and applicants could easily just click on an open lot, write down the information, and then upload an application. In a 2-week period, we got 2,000 hits. So prior to this, right, they had very few applications, very few residents knew about any of this because there just wasn't the information out there. So in the first year alone, the city received 400 phone calls requesting more information and then over 100 applications. But then to date, so again, this started in 2013, to date, the city has sold a little bit over 1,200 of the lots, and a little bit less than 400 of those were in the greater Inglewood neighborhood. So in conversations with representatives from the city, they really mentioned that although, that they mentioned that they, along with RAGE, were currently working with residents on ways to develop the large lots. So the way the program works is you purchase this lot of land on anywhere on the block where you own a home for $1, and then you can hold on to it for 15 years. You don't really have to pay anything more. And then in 15 years, if you want to sell it for market rate, you can sell it for market rate. If you want to, tomorrow, you bought it today for $1, tomorrow you want to work with a developer to put a building on there, you can do that as long as it's zoned correctly. If you want to create a community garden, you want to create a playground, whatever you want to do with that space, you can do with it. But a lot of residents were, they didn't know like what they could do with these spaces. And so the city had partnered with RAGE to kind of really start doing some creative placemaking workshops, to really start working with residents, partnering residents with developers to see how is it that they wanted those spaces engaged. So while this project is very limited, and I'm happy to talk about all the ways it's limited during Q&A, it really does start that process of building Black wealth and breaking, impacts of gentrification and displacement in a neighborhood that had very high rates of poverty, very low rates of unemployment, right? Very low rates of home ownership. So it is doing the work of starting to build Black wealth over time. But again, there are some limitations to that. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later. And then when we look at Little Village, one of the main issues that arose during my time there was I'm just going to check the time. Okay, was the need for additional park space in the area. There was a park, but residents had to cross anywhere from 2 to 5 gang lines to access it. It wasn't well maintained. It was very dangerous trying to get there. And so residents wanted another park built within the community. Despite that clear need, though, the city was really against developing the new park. They engaged in a lot of kind of nefarious and messed up strategies to prevent a park being built. And I can talk about what that was like later. And then in an effort to try and ensure that the park failed, they felt like, well, if we tap Alvejo, which was a very small organization, to lead this initiative, it may not get off the ground. So there was a reason why Alvejo was initially asked. The organization did not have the internal capacity. They had 5 community organizers at the time to really advocate or create development plans for the park. But they did know, and they were very strategic with networking. They knew how to tap into their networks. They knew how to get the knowledge they needed to get things done. And so they really capitalized on that. And to do that, they worked with local university graduate students, local businesses, national environmental organizations like Sierra Club, and other environmental activists, and also the city of Chicago, because if you're going to do something that large scale, you always need the city, somehow working with you in order to kind of think through how they can get the park developed. And they really accomplished this through using public land use meetings, meetings with city officials, and then also going door to door, doing that grassroots organizing work of talking to residents about what was the importance of having these spaces? Would residents in the area even want to have a park? But in doing that grassroots work, they started to reveal some other tensions that were arising within the community. So when I was talking to Mario about this, he said, when we went in to talk to these residents, we found out that that part of the neighborhood isn't only intellectually and emotionally neglected, it's physically neglected as well. You go in and some streets are really crappy. Some streets don't even have sidewalks or whatever. Some roads aren't even paved. And then he says, so we go in and we start talking to residents and they were like, you sure you want to park here? And we were like, yeah, why not? And they were like, all right, cool. Come check out our houses when it floods. And then we learned about other issues going on in that part of the neighborhood. So as Mario was recounting this story to me, he was becoming really furious and frustrated, And he went on to say, people were scared that they would go to the doctor one day and they would be diagnosed with cancer or something. So we initially put the park thing on hold and we're like, okay, let's fix this first. Let's figure out what's going on, with these residents' houses when it rains. So through Alvejo's work on advocating for a park in an intellectually, emotionally, and physically neglected area, they were able to uncover long-term environmental neglect and abuses. So residents knew that their land was contaminated, but they didn't know who was responsible for the contamination or how to go about getting that land cleaned. So through this work, Alvejo learned that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, found contaminated soil dating back to 1989, heard resident complaints in 1996, and then again in 2006. And then after that, agreed to hold the company that owned that site accountable for cleanup. An approved plan for that cleanup, however, wasn't actually agreed upon until 2008, after consistent pressure was placed on them by members of Alvejo. And that included, community activists having to continually question, call the EPA, videotape illegal dumping, investigate damaged waste storage containers, report pollution rates to the EPA and the city, They had to consistently engage in kind of these guerrilla tactics to prove that this land is contaminated, it needs to get cleaned, it's impacting residents, So even though the EPA found, pollution dating back to the site in 1989, they really didn't actually start mobilizing to get this cleaned up until community activists became involved, right? And that all happened just through that grassroots organizing, going door to door and asking. So the EPA's negligence regarding this oversight of the remediation of cleaning up that land really underlines the challenges of community groups when they try to confront, right, and attempt to remedy the repercussions of past unequal development policies that have really allowed for the demise of poor communities of color, especially as it relates to environmental racism. At the same time, however, it also highlights the importance of local residents and community groups in not only advocating for certain types of development, but also ensuring that legal mandates are followed, right? And that local politicians and corporations are held accountable. So just going in and trusting that the government, right, or local nonprofits would take care of these things clearly didn't do anything, right? Because it remained contaminated for almost 20 years. But also just totally checking out, right, what the literature says happens, you know, engaging in apathetic mistrust, nothing's going to happen, also wouldn't have done anything. Instead, right, the community activists in Little Village used that strategic mistrust, used that collective skepticism to really, right, get these additional gains for the neighborhoods. So after years of working to ensure that adequate cleanup of the site happened, they ended up getting a 21.5-acre park. It was labeled a Superfund site, totally remediated, is now capped as a brownfield site, and a park is built on top of it. It has 2 artificial turf fields, 3 grassy fields where people have like picnics and hang out, a skate park for, I'm forgetting what that's called, but that thing with the low board, skateboarding, and then also a large playground, picnic stations, and a multi-use trail. So this image here just gives you a rendering of what the park looks like today. And then these are some images, right, of what was happening during the community outreach process, and then how residents are really using the park today. So when we really think about the initiatives in both neighborhoods, right, they were accomplished through strategic networking, through understanding the ways that trust is linked to privilege and power, and then also using this idea of collective skepticism to strategically network and ensure that residents were not only, right, getting the skills and the training they needed to hold politicians accountable, but also building that leadership within their neighborhoods. So Rage and Alvajo train and empower local residents to do that coalition building, but they also, right, consistently ensure that residents aren't engaging in either apathetic mistrust or fully trusting that the city is going to have their best interest in mind. So in working in Chicago, I learned the importance of a lot of things, right? This included access to clean public green spaces, strategic partnerships, and also group enjoyment and playfulness for building social cohesion. I learned about the importance of situating ourselves as scholars and students within these, right, these networks of power, and really considering how we might also be unintentionally contributing to the ongoing marginalization of communities of color. And then finally, I also learned that there's tremendous positive change that can happen when we put aside our differences and work towards common goals, while also consistently remaining suspicious of the state. So I'll end it there, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you may have. And I will stop sharing.
Applause, everyone. That was brilliant. Wow, I learned so much. Thank you, Professora. So if you can help me in the chat, I don't know if you can see the chat, of answer Diane's first question. Diana. So Diana Lopez, if you could just scroll up.
So what constitutes a strategic partnership? That's a really good question, right? So it's thinking about what are the goals that we have? If it's for development, if it's for neighborhood change, if it's for a kind of social movement, what are the goals that the residents in the neighborhood have? And then who outside of the neighborhood, or maybe sometimes in the neighborhood, but who can help you achieve those goals? So if we think about the park, right, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, they had to really think about who do we need to partner with to ensure the EPA does their due diligence, right? That means partnering with residents, but also partnering with the city, partnering with other environmental justice organizations, thinking about, you know, if they needed, they hired a lawyer through the Sierra Club. So they partnered with a kind of a national environmental justice organization to really get that to happen. If you're thinking about combating gentrification, which many, right, of our communities are contending with right now, then it might mean, you know, do we partner with other developers who have different models of development? Do we partner with urban planners? Do we partner with, you know, people at the city level? Do we partner with activists to, right, really kind of to ensure that we don't get displaced? So it's about really being clear, what are our goals? What is it that we're trying to achieve, and who can help us achieve those goals?
Gracias. I really appreciate the question and the answer. Also, Jay Thomas Gomez asked the question, if you could see that one. At 146.
So how does the relation to the working communities during research? Yeah, so absolutely. I would say, you know, it takes, when we think about, you know, building these relationships with activist organizations, it requires, this is what I tell my students, a lot of humility, a lot of listening, and a lot of asking questions, right? Not entering into these spaces assuming we have all the answers, assuming that we know everything, or assuming that we're going in to help these people, right? Rather, it's about going in and saying, you know, how can we learn from activists on the ground? How can we learn, right, from these community organizations who've been doing this work oftentimes for decades, right? People on the ground, they know what the issues are, and oftentimes they also know what the solutions are. It's just about getting folks to listen, right? So how is it that we can go into these spaces, collaborate, create a partnership, and say, okay, well, you know, I want to learn from you as a researcher, as a scholar, as a student. These are the skills I have. How might my skills help you achieve whatever those goals are that you have? And how can we work together? Not, you know, not that I'm working for you or you're helping me, but rather how are we working together to achieve whatever it is that those goals are.
Gracias, profesora. So there's also one for David Herrera.
So as a researcher currently engaged in fieldwork, studying environmental justice organizations, what helped facilitate building trust? Yeah, were there boundaries you had to set? Absolutely. So I actually think that these activist organizations should be a little bit more suspicious of us scholars because, and I say that, you know, kind of tongue in cheek, but because at the end of the day, as much as I am committed, right, to my communities and to my people, I also have competing sometimes interests because this is my job, right? And so I have to think about what are the constraints of my job while I'm in these spaces, and how do I ensure that I'm fully transparent in that. So I tell folks, like, at the end of the day, you know, I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, and so always treat me with some level of suspicion as well. Ask to verify my data, right? And so I give people, as I'm writing up narratives of field notes, I'll give them to the community members that I'm working with and say, hey, do you want to look them over? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they're like, no, I'm too busy. That's fine, right? If I've written an article, I'll say, hey, do you want to look at the article just to fact check anything? I use anonymity to protect people's identity, but I also use organizational names, and I'll use people's real names if they've given a quote in like a newspaper or something, because that also holds me a little bit more accountable, right, to community members, because they can come back and say, no, that's not right. This is my organization. That's not what my organizations did. You like made a mistake somewhere. And then I have to fix that, right? So it's about constantly reminding folks that, yes, I'm committed, right, to doing this work, and I want to, right, work together on ensuring that this work is realized, but I am also a researcher and a scholar, and this is what that means, right? And so you should consistently, yes, there has to be some level of trust there, but also engage in collective skepticism, right? Collective skepticism is about working together toward common goals, not necessarily consistently building trust with each other.
Yes, these are all excellent questions and responses. We have one from Alexis.
See if I can find that one. How do you get people arrested? That's a hard one. How do you get people to care in our own communities? That's hard. And sometimes we think that it takes a whole lot of people, but really you only need a core, like 5 to 10 people, really committed folks to get the work done that can actually create a tremendous amount of social change, right? We oftentimes think, it has to be thousands or hundreds. No, a core group, 5 to 10 people to get that park, right, identified as a Superfund site, CAP turned into a brownfield site, 21.5-acre park built upon it. It was 5 organizers consistently doing the work, right? Getting residents involved and talking to people, but it was 5 organizers doing that work day in and day out. And really it was 2 because the other 3 had other projects to work on, right? So that's part of it. The other thing is to what I have found, and this leads into the new project that I'm doing, is that make stuff fun, right? Like think about the stuff you want to do, right? You don't want to go to some boring meeting where somebody's talking about everything's terrible and the world's burning around us and then we're all depressed. It's true, right? It is true, but how can we bring some levity into this, right? Within communities of color, we like to laugh, right? We like to listen to music. We like to dance. So bring some of that into these spaces as well and remind ourselves that the reason that we're doing this work is so that we can be more joyful. And the more joyful we are, the more interest it will bring to other folks as well. But it is hard. I'm not going to say that it's easy. It is really hard work.
Yeah, once again, great question and response. Sephora has an excellent question as well.
Yeah, so I have 2 major projects. One, going back to this idea of joy, I'm looking at public articulations of joy and playfulness amongst adult Black and Brown populations in a predominantly Latino city in Massachusetts called Lawrence, Massachusetts. So how are people, having fun in public, using public space to laugh, enjoy each other's company, reimagine, right, the idea of Black and Brown populations in public spaces, this idea for celebration rather than always being suspicious of this. So that's the first project. The second one is looking at issues of water quality and how do we improve water quality? How do we improve water testing within, mostly within low-income communities of color? Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.